This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
You're listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, David Thomas, OBE, CEO of Axiom Maths, former secondary head teacher and government advisor, also co-founder of Oak National Academy. We're discussing whether asking what schools are for is a waste of time.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
If you've listened to my show before on a Friday morning, you'll know that after a career in education, I'm exploring what schools are for. With the help of academics and writers, we've looked at different aspects of schools and education, their purposes. We've explored the pros and cons of examinations, preparing people, be critical thinkers, be citizens, to create identity, and so on. This week, my guest, David Thomas, a former head teacher who has been awarded an OBE for his work in education, thinks that such questions are a waste of time. How do I know? Because I came across David's tweet on Twitter, or X, in which he expressed that view. Naturally enough, I contacted David, and he was good enough to join me on the show so that we could explore whether indeed much of what I've been trying to do these last few weeks and months has indeed been a waste of time. Surprisingly, I rather enjoyed this discussion, and I think you will too. And as the music dies away, we're back with my guest, David Thomas. And David, we were talking about the very strange way of coming into contact with you. Normally, I reach out to guests because they've got teaching experience or because they have written something which seems to help me answer, as my listeners will know, the question of what schools are for. And I set off on this rather elevated journey to discover what schools are for. And then I think I discovered on Twitter, not a medium I use much. I may have tweeted 3 times in my life, if it's still called tweeted. And I saw an observation you made that asking the question, what schools are for, is not a valuable question. I'm like, I'm going to start by guessing why, and I can guess from your observations that asking the question, what schools are for, is not that valuable because it's a distraction from teaching. Because we know what schools are for. We have that already in our minds. We know what schools are for. And because maybe it undermines the confidence of teachers. And I'm thinking that's the sort of argument we're going to have, or discussion we're going to have, really, because I sympathize with some of those. And, oh, by the way, David, welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. I should have done that right away.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's all to come onto your show because I disagreed with the basic premise of your show.
Yes.
It wasn't what I expected when I tweeted, oh, God, this is a silly question. People, we should stop asking it. Please turn around. So actually, this is my entire radio show. It feels a bit risky coming on the basis that I told you that what you're doing isn't a good thing. No, I mean, I'm not saying that this isn't an interesting question to ask, right? And I'm not saying we don't have views now. I've got strong views about what I think schools are for, and maybe we can talk about some of that. The reflection that I made was I was in a bunch of conversations over a period of time where we were talking about challenges in education, challenges in the school system, where in each of those discussions, it didn't take very long for someone to say a variant of, well, the problem is in this country, we just don't know what schools are for. And that's the thing that's going to resolve our challenges. I just don't think that's true. I think when people say the problem is that we just don't know what schools are for, what they mean is the problem is that people don't agree with me about what schools are for, and that there are a variety of different views. And I guess my take on it is we're not going to agree about the details of exactly what schools are for, because some people think schools are preparation for work. Some people think schools are about inducting people into society. Some people think schools are about giving people experiences they otherwise wouldn't get. There are lots of these things, all of which are reasonable, and people combine them in different weightings. And so my argument was, look, instead of spending all of our time trying to engage in a big philosophical discussion about what schools are for, why don't we concentrate our efforts on just making it easier to run a great school, regardless of what you think it is? If you want to run a school that is more weighted towards preparation for employment, let's make it easier for you to do that. If you want to run a school that is more weighted towards a variety of human experiences, great, let's make it easier for you to do that. If you want to run your school that is more about civic society and bringing people into adulthood and into society, and the things that are going to make it easier to run all of those different schools well are actually probably common. They are resolving the challenges that we're facing around teacher recruitment and retention. They're resolving challenges we're facing in children's social care. So I think the things that make it easier to run a great school for all of the different views about what schools are for are probably relatively common, and they're quite concrete and they're quite practical. And so my contention was, I think this whole kind of what schools are for thing is a big philosophical distraction, and we can actually make all types of schools much more successful if we solve some of the common challenges.
Yes, absolutely. I can see your point. When you're in the midst of education, when you're working day to day and in the deep woods of it, and all you can see is the trees, it could easily seem a waste of time or a distraction to ask questions like, what are schools for? And if you're in a meeting where you're trying to organize the textbooks for next year, and there's a problem with the year nines, and there's all sorts of difficulties that need to be solved now, and someone says, well, the problem is it's the government. Well, the problem is it's the national curriculum. And you go, well, yeah, but it's not something we can solve today. So let's get on with ordering the textbooks, dealing with the year nines curriculum for next year and sorting that out. So it becomes a distraction for us to say, well, we teachers cannot solve this because we're in the midst of an organizational system, an education system, indeed a sort of philosophical construct that we didn't make. There's a plurality of schools. There's the Michaela School, and there's Summerhill, and there's Progressive Education, and all these. We have a nice and super different schools, people experimenting with things and so on, which I think leads you in the direction of a sort of marketplace of schools. Out of that, some sort of good systems will emerge. But underneath all that, we know the basics. Well, do we? And I would suggest that this plurality of schools is premised upon experimentation, marketplace experimentation, innovation, which betrays the underlying uncertainty that we're not really certain what schools are for. And yet we persist with the idea that underneath all these variations of school, we sort of know what schools are for. And if we do, I bet we'll conclude a series of sort of rather open-ended platitudes about preparing students for the future, giving them the best opportunities, giving them life chances, giving them a series of skills and things. And then inside that, we're still, as you rightly say, well, yeah, but how do we do those things? So in a sense, it's both answering the question, saying, I know the answer to the question what schools are for, but I also don't think we know the answer what schools are for. We shouldn't ask it anyway. Well, into that vacuum comes all sorts of things. It becomes a completely unqualified person called a prime minister who decides that we should learn maths till 18. Now, that may be, and there may be lots of merits in learning maths till 18, but he can simply say that because anyway, that thought that you've just had enfranchises anyone to become an expert in teaching. So he says, well, we all agree on what basic principles of school are, but I think I've got a jolly good idea to how to run a local school, so I'll do it. So you get the free school movement and the idea that any sensible human being can run a school. It's not really grounded in any full and complete understanding of what schools are for.
again, I think a bunch of your challenges, right? Obviously, this started from me sending out one tweet, which was sort of deliberately and a bit of frustration.
Oh, well,
Uh,
that's what tweets are for.
uh, so you're absolutely right, Nick. I think that there should be a plurality of different schools, because I still think that asking the question what schools are for and trying to have a big debate about it, we're not going to reach, I don't think, an answer, because I do just think that people have different legitimate views, and I'm all right with that, because I don't think we can prove that one is right and another is wrong. And so I'm happy for people to, choose to run very slightly different things. And that one of the things I think, you talk about free schools, with a big plurality of different models, right? You've got a Michaela, you've got School 21, you've got all these different schools. One of the things I think is, if you have a team of very good people who are very committed to a model and really believe in it and really want to make it work, they're normally successful. The buy-in of all of those people, the buy-in of the parents, the buy-in of the children, the buy-in of the staff, the belief that you're on a shared mission, because that's the foundation of culture, and school culture sort of seems to matter more than pretty much anything else, right? So if you can get that shared buy-in around a vision, that sets the foundation for a really successful culture, and a really successful culture sets the foundation for a great school, right? One of the things that it's taught us is that getting that buy-in matters. And so that's one of the reasons that I think a plurality of different types of school in terms of what they're for is useful. There are teachers with different views, parents with different views, pupils with different views. And if you're able to group people around shared missions and shared visions, then you've got the foundation of really strong culture. And that's more likely to make schools good. Now, of course, I've got a preference, right? I'm sure you've got a preference. We know what we would choose for our children. We know where we would choose to work. We know what we think is a safer bet, all other things held equal. And we might agree, we might disagree. I don't know. Maybe we'll find out during the course of this conversation. But I'm quite happy to say not everyone has to completely agree with me, because having that plurality in the system is good.
Reading Solutions UK. Are you looking for best practices and innovative strategies to foster confident, lifelong readers? Join the free online International Reading Conference on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. Hear from speakers like TV personality and education expert Basit Siddiqui, beloved children's author Michael Rosen, fluency expert Tim Rosinski, EEF specialist Chloe Butlin, the National Literacy Trust's Irene Picton, and a range of experienced practitioners, including MAT leaders, deputy heads, heads of English, high-level teaching assistants, and school librarians. Through the 3-day conference, speakers will explore a range of topics at the forefront of the current educational landscape, with sessions relevant for all educators and key stages. Visit Reading Solutions at readingsolutionsuk.co.uk for more information and to sign up for this free conference.
You're listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, David Thomas, OBE, founder of Oak National Academy, former head teacher. We are discussing whether asking what schools are for is a waste of time.
And I think a great variety of schools, the way schools are managed, the way schools are accountable, and so on. And so in that sense, the plurality of schools is a conversation. I mean, if I look at a Michaela school and I say, well, I don't like the sound of that, I say, this is exactly how we should do it. What they're proposing to me is, this is what schools are for. Now, you might say, well, they're not doing that. What they're doing is they're trying something out. And if it works, it works. We'll take the strengths of it, even if it's just an experiment in things. And I've heard the headmistress of being interviewed a number of times. She says, look, this isn't for everyone, this school. This is our school. This is what we do here. It's not, I'm not necessarily proposing, because it is continually proposed as a model for other schools. And it may be a good model. It may not be a good model. As you say, we have our preferences. But in its existence, it's an experiment in answering the question, what schools are for.
Yeah. There are times that this is a helpful question to ask, and there are times it's an unhelpful question to ask, or at least I'm contending that there are some times it's an unhelpful question to ask. But I don't think I am going as far as saying it's never a helpful question to ask. Of course, if you're sitting around writing a free school bid, or, you know, as the governors and staff team of a school, thinking about what you want to achieve over the next, X years, you are answering the question, what you think schools are for, right? Because you're trying to say, well, what should our goals be? And that is asking what you think schools are for. So, of course, if you are an individual school and you're planning and setting your vision, setting your mission, deciding what you want to do, that is you asking what you think you're for. And the answer to that question is what leads you to decide, how much do I spend on my extracurricular program? How much do I spend on staff development? How much do I put into pastoral versus academic? All of those sorts of decisions that you end up making and running a school derive from what you think your school is for. So maybe, I guess what I'm saying and what you're pushing me towards is it's a really important question to answer very explicitly what you think your school is for. All I'm saying is I'm not sure it's helpful for us to aim to reach national agreement about what all schools should be for.
Schools that underneath the very strict, very traditional school, or underneath the very progressive school, you find a sort of simplicity of schools. I absolutely fundamentally powerfully agree with this. If my experience in teaching ever taught me anything, it taught me what you said, the truth of what you said, is that if you can get people to buy into it, if you have a community of teachers, pupils, and management, if they believe in something, it'll work. So I don't doubt for a minute, whatever I think about Michaela's school, if I went there, I'd think it works in its own terms because they satisfy those boxes. They believe in what they're doing. And there's a sort of paradox there, because if we say, well, that's true, it is simple running schools, just sort of get on with it then why do we get it so wrong? Why across the country can I identify a whole series of failings in our education system? That our plurality of schools, our experimentation, which has been going on quite some time now. We've been messing around with schools, and I could go down the direction that they're also oddly not messed around with. They're very similar to what schools of the 19th century in some ways. Since the end of the Second World War, we've been politicizing schools, we've been experimenting with schools, we've been changing schools for various purposes. And yet we seem to be saying it's quite simple. Let's just get on with it. So why do we get it so wrong? Why are we doing a fair amount of harm? And I think our education system does that. I think we could identify places where schools aren't doing what we've described is a simple, straightforward thing. And they're failing in so many, many ways.
Yeah. The simple things aren't always easy. And very often something that is conceptually simple, very hard to do. I mean, Daisy Christodoulou introduced me once to the idea of the knowing-doing gap. And that lots of the hardest things that we try and do is bridge a knowing-doing gap. So it's very easy to know that the most important thing in the school is getting buy-in from everyone involved in that shared and collective endeavor to be able to build a really strong culture. And then if you're all pulling in the same direction, you'll be able to achieve great things. It's a simple thing to know. Take schools out of the equation. Just think about all organizations, all group, whether they are employers or community organizations, groups of people across the world. Yeah. What proportion manage to achieve, despite the fact that every business course has talked about, culture eats strategy for breakfast on day one of your business course. But how many businesses achieve? A very small proportion, right? Because it's a simple thing to understand. It's a simple thing to say, but bridging that knowing-doing gap, making it happen is really, really hard. And also just takes time, right? Because you're trying to change humans. Teaching is a fundamentally human thing. It is about people. It's about emotions. And it's not as simple as saying, well, what I need to do is to make everybody trust me. How do you build trust in communities that feel let down and have felt let down for a really long period of time? How do you build trust in places where people aren't particularly inclined to want to trust you? And that takes time. That's hard. Lots of schools don't manage it, but lots of other organizations also don't manage it.
And I think that's a message that has been promoted, I recall, in teaching, saying things of that kind, that we all need to bind ourselves together. We need to work as a community and getting the culture right. Lots of effort went into constructing a culture. What I felt was happening was that what we decided was that teaching was essentially a managerial problem. And as you say, it wasn't a million miles different from how you might run a successful corporation or the British Army or a civil service. Any organization could look at the features of get the culture right, as you say, and everything else follows. And while there's an absolute truth in that, I think organizations that are successful organizationally need a strong culture. What's their purpose? And if the purpose of this organization, the successful one, and I've been in schools where they haven't got that right, and it's a terrible sight to see, where the management are out of touch with the teachers and so on. So yes, get that right. But to what purpose?
So while I completely accept your point, very good point, that culture trumps organization, because I've been in plenty of schools where the culture is wrong and it's horrible. And my happiest experiences of teaching were when the culture was good. When I taught in a sixth form, I taught A-levels to students. I had a very happy time. The culture was good. The students had bought into what we were doing. But all I'm saying there is that design can be effective or design can be ineffective. Design can be good. Design can be poor. So, for instance, if I was talking of cars, some cars work better than others. Some cars are stylish. Some cars are beautiful. Some cars are more economical. And so some cars are safer. But fundamentally, a transport system that depends on so much traffic and so many cars is polluting, is destructive, kills an awful lot of young people on our roads, and so on. And those truths we don't like to confront. And the questions of fundamentally changing our system of transport, just like fundamentally looking at what schools are for, seems like an impossible, highfalutin, as I said at the beginning of this, elevated conversation. But when you do look in a non-managerial, let's just design good schools that work well in their own terms, way at education, you can start seeing some pretty unpleasant things about our education system.
So then you come back to my premise of my show, which is, well, let's go beyond that. Once we've agreed that organizationally, schools, you have to get it right. You have to get the culture right. You have to get the values right and so on. You have to get people to buy into that. Well, and I think out there, if we don't answer that question, the door opens up and you say, well, it's for sorting students into success and failures. An awful lot of students will fail, even though we'll continually be telling them that we're about developing all of their interests, all of their capacities to the greatest possible extent. In fact, our system is designed to ensure that about 30% of them will fail. And there, I think, we teachers are plodding along in the machine. What is this organization that we're involved in, that we want to work? What is education for in our society? Is it to differentiate between success and failure?
We should come back to that, because obviously we've got views about what we think education's for. But I don't think you can separate the great culture from what we think the purpose of the school is, right? I think they link together. I mean, Daniel Pink talks about motivation as being mastery, autonomy, and purpose. You get the combination of mastery, autonomy, and purpose, and you can get motivation. So if you want to have a motivated staff body working together in a school, what do you need? You need mastery. You need them to feel like they're doing something that they're getting better at. They're mastering their craft. You need them to feel like they've got some autonomy or agency over things so that they're not just sort of automatons. And you need the purpose. If you don't feel like you've got the purpose, then you're missing one of the legs of the stool, right? And the stool falls over. I don't think you can sort of separate and order them in that way. I think they're intertwined. That everything you've been saying about if you're running your school, you need to understand what you're saying it's for is true, because I don't think you can build the great culture without it feeling like a shared endeavor. And the shared endeavor needs to have a shared destination that you think you're trying to get to.
Yes.
And so if you want to have that motivation as a collective, as a group, then I feel like you do need that shared purpose, and you need to be able to articulate it to be able to pull together. I think if you just gave everyone the mastery and the autonomy, but the purpose is wrong for them, then they're not going to feel happy and excited and motivated.
We could easily find, without walking too far from our front doors, schools where those things aren't happening, where there is a disconnect between the management and what teachers are doing, where the pupils do not feel involved in the values of the school. And he said it's a managerial book, and you can see how to do this. Google have cracked it or something like that. Let's do it that way. Steve Jobs has done it. So let's just simply do that in the school. Well, why are so many schools failing to? I think that's because pupils, particularly, because I think the emperor's new clothes, I think students can see what's really going on. And they can walk into a school and they can see we're all in this together. You can be anything you want to be. They realize they're being gaslighted within a system, in a sense. And they know when they are. That will ensure some of them fail. I mean, you could have very well-oiled organizations that produce quite unpleasant outcomes compared with the Nazis, but they were probably good at maths. The Nazis were probably good at train timetables. They were probably well organized. I think my problem here more with secondary schools than primary schools. If you have secondary schools that at the end result turn out students who've considered school a failure for them, and while they were at school didn't enjoy that experience, not because the school necessarily got the organization wrong, but because they could see through it. They realized that the purpose was really quite a malign purpose. If school is there to differentiate between those who will have lives that are varied, autonomous and successful and those that won't, then they know what the school is about. Very quickly, students will pick up on that. And the teachers will realize what they're doing too. And you'll get unpleasant sorts of treatment of students and so on, which can take place in the schools because the teachers know that the discipline they're trying to impose on the students is a sham, in the sense that what we're trying to do is simply mask over the underlying inequalities and unfairness of the system. So these are societal problems, I get that, not to be solved on a Wednesday afternoon when you're having a staff meeting, but worth asking because they come to the fundamentals of exams, what we teach, and how we organize our schools over the long run. And what we get are 19th century schools, a curriculum that is barely changed in labels, at least, since the late 19th century.
So, I mean, you're opening up a lot of boxes. I'm not sure which one to take first.
Hey,
So, let's try and close up the sort of organizational bit first. I mean,
Yeah.
If motivation is mastery, autonomy, and purpose, people get motivated when they have an aligned purpose. And so, I don't think that the sort of caricature of you can have a really well organized, really well-oiled organization where everything works brilliantly, but people don't have an aligned purpose. I don't think that's true. I think they've got to have an aligned purpose. It's just that people can align around a purpose that we don't think is good. Right? I mean, that's perfectly possible.
I suppose that is
It's
indeed what I'm
example.
saying, that you can say to teachers, the purpose of our school is to pass the next Ofsted. The purpose of our school is to get the exam results up in year, whatever, get the progress 8 numbers up. And I've been to a lot of staff meetings where you realize the purpose of the school can be projected onto a PowerPoint as a graph.
And what's interesting about that, right? 'Cause I think you're absolutely right. There are plenty of teachers who report being in schools where they feel the purpose of the school is the Ofsted inspection, the purpose of the school is the graph with the results and so on. But what's interesting to me is that none of those feel like they end up being successful schools, right? Because that's not a great purpose.
Yeah.
It doesn't motivate the team, doesn't motivate people, it doesn't motivate the kids. Kids are not motivated by sitting in assembly and being told, we get to change the banner on the outside of the school if you all do X, Y, and Z. Teachers are not highly motivated by it. So it matters to them a bit. Of course, that you have some pride in your workplace. You want to tell people that your headline results of the place that you work are good. It matters a little bit, but that's not a kind of deep purpose that gets you out of bed in the morning. Lots of schools do this, but I think even by their own measure, they're not successful at doing it, right? Because that's not an effective purpose. It doesn't bind people together. And that doesn't pull you together as a team because it's not enough, because none of us ultimately think that's what schools are for, right? If you come back to my thing, which is that successful schools work because you bind together a group of people who think that they are in shared endeavour. Improving our Ofsted is just a bad way of doing that. Like, it's not an effective shared endeavour because it doesn't motivate people. No one thinks that's what their school is for.
For Teachers Talk Radio News with my guest, David Thomas, former secondary school head teacher, CEO at Axiom Maths, and co-founder of Oak National Academy, as we discuss whether asking what schools are for is a waste of time.
Solutions UK. Are you looking for best practices and innovative strategies to foster confident, lifelong readers? Join the free online International Reading Conference on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. Hear from speakers like TV personality and education expert Basit Siddiqui, beloved children's author Michael Rosen, fluency expert Tim Rosinski, EEF specialist Chloe Butlin, the National Literacy Trust's Irene Picton, and a range of experienced practitioners, including MAT leaders, deputy heads, heads of English, high-level teaching assistants, and school librarians. Through the 3-day conference, speakers will explore a range of topics at the forefront of the current educational landscape, with sessions relevant for all educators and key stages. Visit Reading Solutions at readingsolutionsuk.co.uk for more information and to sign up for this free conference.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC reports on proposed changes to sex and relationship education guidance for schools in England. According to the report on the news website, government sources have told the BBC about the plans, which include banning sex education for under 9s, as well as additional guidance for teaching about gender identity. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said the new guidance would ensure children were not exposed to disturbing content. Teachers have responded with concerns that some of the guidance appears contradictory and say there is no evidence of a widespread problem with current guidance. The new plans say secondary school pupils will learn about protected characteristics such as sexual orientation and gender reassignment, but makes it clear that schools should not teach about the concept of gender identity. It said it was right to take a cautious approach. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, speaking on BBC Breakfast, said biological sex is the basis of relationship, sex and health education, not these contested views. ASCL's General Secretary said that it was important that banning the teaching of gender identity did not shut down discussion, and that young people must be able to discuss this without their teachers feeling in peril of saying something wrong. The new guidance also strengthens rules to make it easier for parents to access teaching materials to see what their children are learning, although many point out that this guidance is currently in place. Lucy Emerson of the Sex Education Forum said, "If topics were to be restricted, it will leave children even more dependent on getting answers from online sources." The draft guidance is now open to a 9-week consultation, but once finalised will be statutory. An outline of the proposed new age restrictions can be found on the BBC News website and the consultation on the Department for Education website. In the United States, pro-Palestinian protests at colleges and universities have made the news again, as some graduates from Duke University in North Carolina staged a walkout. The protest came just prior to a speech by veteran comedian Jerry Seinfeld, who was due to receive an honorary degree. Mr. Seinfeld has been a vocal supporter of Israel since the 7th of October attacks by Hamas. Some students stayed to hear the speech, but videos posted on social media also showed some booing and chanting slogans in support of Palestine. Whilst the ceremony at Duke went ahead, plans at other universities, including Columbia and the University of Southern California, have cancelled or restructured their main graduation ceremonies to avoid further complications. The Daily Mirror features comments from Strictly Judge Shirley Ballas about free school meals. She focuses on her own experiences of being raised by a single mother and says she understands what increasing numbers of British children living in poverty are going through. She recalls looking forward to her free school meal, referring to it as a nice lunch every day. At 63, Ms. Ballas is hoping to use her experiences to highlight the issue of poverty by being part of an ITV documentary called Kids in Poverty. According to the Mirror, 4.3 million children in Britain get their only meal a day at school. 30% of UK children are living below the poverty line, with 1 million classed as being in extreme poverty. Figures from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation say that the share of children living in absolute poverty has increased by 148% since 2017 and is at its highest level for 30 years. The documentary can be seen on demand, and full details of the article from the Mirror are on its website. Finally, students at Lancaster University have voted for all food served on campus to be plant-based, according to BBC Radio Lancashire. The Students' Union is supporting the gradual transition to 100% vegan menus, with a target of 50% by 2025 and 100% by 2027. A campaigner told the BBC that Lancaster University has a goal of net zero by 2035, and that implementing a plant-based catering system aligns with this goal. The Countryside Alliance said too few students had been involved in the decision, with 18 of the 19 delegates on the Students' Union Council, who do represent 13,000 students, voting to support the motion. But the Countryside Alliance called it an attack on freedom of choice and said the decision should have been put to a wider student vote. Universities including Stirling, Warwick and Newcastle have also voted to go plant-based, although Edinburgh rejected the plan. The votes have been organised following Animal Rising's Plant-Based Universities campaign. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
If the answers to what schools are for is actually those things, community and a shared endeavour and so on, so many schools where you walk in, you don't feel that. You say, have they not understood the message? You get the staff together in the staff room, don't worry about Ofsted. And the teacher said to you, our careers depend on this. Or you say, the trouble is you shouldn't focus too much on exams. Get away from the externalities, concentrate on what happens in the classroom, the relationship between you and the students. And they say, but again, it's all very well you take those exams are how the parents will judge this school. And if the exam results are bad, they won't send their students here. They'll try and get them out of the catchment and down we'll go. And this will be not a good place to teach because we know that part of our community is depending on the trust we have with our parents. Won't walk around the corridors and take in the culture. They'll take in the exam results at the end of the day. On the bus queue, the parents will say that school gets good results or that school doesn't. So it's a hard thing to say. The end result of that is the teacher then says to you, well, David, let's get rid of Ofsted because we're clear that's not essential to the schools we've just described their purpose. Let's get rid of exams largely. There are all sorts of countries in the world with very few. And let's concentrate on the things that we've started to say. So we're discarding that certain things are making it more difficult to do what we've just agreed a good school should do. So let's get rid of those things. Let's focus on the core values of school and not a distraction, Ofsted, exams, and a system imposed on schools from outside.
I wouldn't abolish Ofsted and I wouldn't abolish exams. It doesn't mean I wouldn't change either of those things. It doesn't mean I don't have a list of things that I would like to tweak about Ofsted and a list of things I would like to tweak in the accountability system. I wouldn't get rid of them. But there are lots of reasons why, not all of which are relevant to this discussion. But the thing that you just said, the problem for me, right, is that the approach of saying what we want is a better Ofsted and what we want is better exam results. Therefore, we are going to focus entirely on better Ofsted and better exam results, I think is self-defeating on its own terms, right? This is a bad way of improving your Ofsted and improving your exam results. Like a better way to improve your Ofsted and improve your exam results, as I think we see loads of case studies of, probably in every school that has great Ofsted and great exam results in a sustained manner over time, is that they've got a really strong culture where everyone there agrees on what the school is for. Yeah, which, look at me coming around to agreeing with the premise of your show. It might be about academic excellence in some of them, right? But it won't be measured in exam results. I'm sure they're talking about academic excellence, and I'm sure they're talking about it almost in a disparaging way about exams, because they're thinking about it as being much more than that. If you look at the schools that have sustained very, very good Ofsteds over time, they are going to be schools where they're probably talking in a disparaging way about Ofsted, because they're saying, well, we're for much more than that. And the schools that only focus on Ofsted and exam results do not get sustained good Ofsted and exam results, because the thing that gives you to a sustained, successful organisation is, that sense of shared purpose. And people do not get excited about and want to commit to an organisation whose only purpose is some kind of external measurement.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the scene in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker is being convinced that if only he could not look at the sword or whatever it is, but look beyond it and feel the force. I mean, we're saying to teachers, look, I know that right here in front of your face is Ofsted and next year's exam results, and you've got to get the Progress 8 up because you've been told by the management, well, that's what we've got to focus on this term. A teacher might be in danger of saying, well, the trouble is with you, John, and you, David, is that what you've just said is what we should all sit around in the staff room and say, what's our purpose here? And how do we create a good culture? If we get that culture right, the good exam results will follow. So don't worry about those. Well, my point is that it's the tail wagging the dog, is that the exam system is such. Should we abolish all exams? They're not. Do we over-exam in this country? Yes, I would say we do. Far too much. There are too many exams on too many things. And they're not conducted in ways that are either fair or reliable. But should we have Ofsted the way it is? Should we get rid of it? Maybe, I don't know. But are we some sort of system of accountability? Absolutely. But we should probably change Ofsted really quite dramatically, because Ofsted mitigate against teachers producing a culture that's successful. It's almost like a sort of argument about society, isn't it? If you get the culture right, everything else will follow. Well, if those things aren't right, then how can you get the culture right? I think, in other words, I think our schools are being poisoned by an exam system which is unreliable and unfair, an Ofsted system which is dominated by values that are arbitrary and imposed politically. And it's difficult for teachers to labour under that and create the kind of culture we've agreed is right and necessary.
So I sort of just don't think that's true at all.
But
part of that is because your explanation of the system completely misses out the role of school leaders. Your explanation at the start of that little segment, right, was about, it's all well and good for sit here and say this, but for the teacher in the staff room who is feeling that pressure and they can't help it. Well, yeah, I think you're right. But there's a missing layer here, right? Which is school leaders. And if you're taking on a leadership job, your job is to create that culture and to create that space in the system. Your job is to worry about regulation and accountability. That is the job. That's what comes with wanting to go into leadership. And it has tremendous rewards on the other side of it as well. But, you are supposed to be thinking about it and being deliberate about what of that you let filter down to your staff and what of that you don't.
Yes.
Right? And your job is to shield from some of it, protect them from some of it, but let bits of it come through in the right way. As a head teacher, I do want my staff to care deeply about the exam results that their children get, because we care deeply about our children and it really matters for their future if they are able to get things that are going to help them get good jobs. That's not the end of the world. I always said the same assembly I used to give to kids all the time, right? Your exam results are not the end of the world, but they are quite helpful. It's going to be easier for you to have a good life if you have got a good set of exam results. It's not the end of the world. It doesn't determine your life at all, but it's just going to make it easier for you. And so we do want and should want kids to do better. Should we have teachers feeling like the entire world is going to fall down on them if they're not able to do this? And of course not. Should we have teachers sitting up, like highlighting through the Ofsted framework, doing things that they think are really silly because the Ofsted framework, their reading of it implies they need to do this? No, of course not. But that's the job of leaders, is to create that culture within the school so that that's not coming.
Yes, it makes me glad that I never rose to the levels of senior manager. Because judging by your description, an awful lot falls on their shoulders, which is why I think it's very difficult to find primary heads these days. Very difficult to find primary heads. And also that Ofsted themselves, then when they turn up to school, there'll be quite a lot of the categories of judging the school will be managerial success, managerial effectiveness, and so on. Again, it seems to come back to this idea that if you can get managers in, then the rest will follow. If you can get the good managers who have the vision and they'll talk about, and again, you start feeling these almost cultish like kind of things like ethos and value and be projected, because it'd be projected by the teacher sets the tone from above. So then the teachers become simply the minions. A good head will come in and turn that culture around. And I think there's an awful lot of that happens in schools where, rather like football managers, the failing team If only we could find the new chap who could come in and turn the team around. So it becomes, again, a managerial problem. And it relies on an idea of the sort of superhead. I forget when I first heard that term. Superheads would come in, they'd be paid a lot of money, they'd come into a school. Or the trust was a managerial problem to running education. It was a different way of arranging schools. But essentially, the trust will justify themselves to a school that's had a trust removed or been removed from a trust. They'll come in and say, we have got the ability to do what you've just described, to get the culture right, to shield you from the effects of Ofsted, whatever their way they'll propose it. But I think essentially they are conning the staff. In the end, those are simply means of masking the underlying truth of it. The school is about much harsher things. Success in Ofsted, or what you will fail in Ofsted. For instance, take the Ruth Perry School.
Well, I'm going to choose to disagree with you a bit again, because
Please do.
you're using managerial, like management, that is a derogatory term, right? Like managerial is bad, management is bad. I think it's really problematic that we take that view in education. I think good management is invaluable. I mean, like, think about what has made me happy in jobs and in employment in the past. The thread that is most important is who my manager was. Like, having a great manager is really important. I don't think that valuing that means people having no say, it all being about the ego of the manager, any of those things. Great managers are not like that. Great management is important. Like, it is a great manager that it creates the environment for a team of people to be able to come together and feel like they're doing something in a collective endeavor, and to be able to organize you and to be able to hold that culture. That's not the same as imposing it. So I wouldn't talk down management, because I think a lot of the problems that we're talking about are about good management. But good management does not mean writing lots of documents, walking around with clipboards, telling people they haven't fulfilled section 17B of the right new framework. Like, that's not what good management is. But I wouldn't talk down management, and I wouldn't say that managerial success is some sort of derogatory thing. I think we should celebrate that. And I think part of the problem with schools is that we don't celebrate good managers. We don't think about the art of line management, art of leading people. We don't celebrate it enough. And I think that's why we end up with a lot of bad management. And therefore, we end up with people using management as a sort of derogatory thing. But to me, great management is invaluable. Which someone said, people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. The thing that is most predictive of your leaving a place is your social group there and your manager. That's the thing that matters. And if you have a great manager, you're going to enjoy work more.
I'll concede that point to you. That my own experience is that it was an awful lot, well, indeed, a lot more enjoyable experience to be in a school where you had good colleagues and it was a convivial and enjoyable and professional work environment, but also good managers. So simply, there's probably more books written on how to manage organizations properly than there are about how to manage school properly. And if school is a managerial problem, I simply say that if we said in school they're a managerial problem, and if you can get managers who understand the things we've identified, and we'll count ourselves as great experts in education, so we've identified these things, that these are the features of a good school, then managers go and do that thing. Then why does it fail? And it comes back to my point, I would suggest, that things like Ofsted, things like the exam system, things like the structure of schools in our country, things that the school can't solve, I get that, can't necessarily solve these things, although the questions are worth asking. Work backwards on schools. The manager's assertion that we're all in this together, we should build a good culture, and no matter how effective they are in certain circumstances, will be overall undermined. So it's a bit like trying to get the corners down on a Tupperware. Schools go from good and outstanding to failing in no time at all, as it seems to be oddly the case. And we go from one generation to the next, talking about large proportion of failing schools or problems within schools. We never solve this problem, even though we've just decided that we've sort of known how to do it. We just need to get the managers right.
I would again come back to knowing doing it, right? It's very easy to write down a set of criteria of what a great manager is. And it's very hard, even when you know that as individuals managing people, it's incredibly hard to actually do all of those things. Even if you write down the 5 to 10 characteristics of great management that you yourself want to embody, when you believe them and hold them, doing it is really hard. If I decide that I don't want to micromanage people, I want them to feel trusted, but I also want them to feel supported. That balancing act is really hard because you're not inside those people's heads. You don't know. And I, as a manager, think about that, try really hard on that. I'm sure I get it wrong all the time because there's a big gap between knowing that that's what I want to do and that's important. And you hone that with experience. Other people will be better, but there are only so many people to go around. And I think that's just the challenge, right? It's a knowing doing out.
Well,
and there aren't that many people who've been great at it. And so
Yes.
we need to think, but in education, we don't value those management skills and the art of management enough. And I think that does lead to more people who haven't been thoughtful about it, haven't been trained in it, and have almost been told that they shouldn't value it because management gets talked down. Sorry, you've kind of got me onto one of my favorite topics, which is
Yes. That's
management
right.
not being valued in education.
I think the managerialism, without trying to be too derogatory about it, is overvalued in our society generally. The enormous rewards that go to people who manage some sort of bank, football club, whatever, reflective of we tolerate those enormous inequalities that someone can earn vastly more money, and it'll always be justified on the grounds that to get the talent. If only this school could be solved, if you could bring someone in, if you could find that person, or if the manager really would simply learn how to do this simple, but as you say, slightly mystically difficult way of doing it. It's going to be so, if you say, well, I don't have enough experience yet to fully do it all the time, I quite often get it wrong. And yet we've described it as something quite simple. The paradox is it's quite simple, but extremely hard to do. So now we need this sort of wizard. The wizard shall come in and that person can do it. Well, that we're condemned forever then to only successful schools that do what we know they should do if we can find this small coterie of wizards who most schools won't have.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's a big problem. That is the way that we think about management, that it's like wizardry. I mean, through an awful lot of education, leadership and management courses. And I say misfortune deliberately. My experience is, and look, I only have the experience that I have, and it's not a full sample of everything. But in my experience, there tends to be some focus on some minutiae, and it tends to be the sort of walking around with a clipboard minutiae of management, like around the documents. How do you write a good document? How do you write a good plan? How do you, tick this box, that box, whatever. So you get a bunch of that. And then you get a big focus on the kind of wizardry stuff, right? On leadership. Workshops where people put up a picture of Gandhi and then they ask you to write down on a post-it note the adjectives you associate with him. And then they'll put Mandela up and ask you to write down the adjectives. And then you get some sort of adjective soup and they're like, and this is leadership. And then your job is to embody all of the adjectives that happen to be on the flip chart paper. And it was really annoyed me because there's a big missing chunk, but it's not wizardry. I was a absurdly young person to be a manager. And I found it very hard because I'd lacked a bunch of experiences and I wanted to empathize with people. And I just hadn't had a big sample of experiences. So lots of the things that I was managing people through, I hadn't had experiences of myself or I didn't have friends who'd had experiences in that. But there are lots of things that are really important that make you a great manager that are not wizardry, but are also not taught. How do you handle the staff member who's just come to you after their 5th miscarriage? How do you handle the staff member who's got this or that or whatever is going on in their life? How do you think about that? What's your mental framework like? And that is what matters for people, right? When we talk about people leaving managers, not organizations, it's not being led well through those things that is a big problem. They are learnable. They're not wizardry. But you're not taught about them. No one thinks about them. Take on a school. I took on a headship. The culture was not good. People did not feel like we were in a shared endeavor. There'd been a lot of leadership churn before me. That meant there wasn't a sense that we all felt like we knew what purpose was. The answer to that is managerial, right? How do you get people together, discuss where you think you're going to go, agree on a shared purpose and set out on a journey together? But it's not wizardry. Like, you don't have to be Mandela or Gandhi. Like, you can learn to do some of that stuff. We over romanticize this sort of generic leadership, undervalue really good management. And I think that means that we get lots of crap management.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I agree with you totally that we overvalue it. There is a cult almost of the great manager who will come in and solve it. They will come in and from the top, oddly, they'll say, we all need to work together. And I know how to get us all to work together if you follow what I do, which is a complete, contradiction. Are good managers made or are good managers born? Well, you can learn how to be a good manager, but then if you can learn how to be good managers, and again, we've been training managers and learning about managerial processes for a very long time. Again, why do schools fail? Why do a persistent number of schools fail? And why does our education system almost seems to be in a permanent state of crisis? I mean, we could identify funding and all sorts of things, but essentially how to run schools, we've disagreed on it, and schools fail to achieve what we seem to be saying is very simple and can be learned. And managers seem to be failing to do this. But you say, well, you're a failing manager, and yet I know how to be a good manager. You can learn this. But they don't. So if managers are a crap manager, as we say, then why haven't we simply taught them not to be?
And I would suggest it's not just a matter of the difference between knowing and doing. Lots of things we know are wrong, but we don't do them. Otherwise, there'd be world peace. It isn't simply that running a good school and being a good manager is really difficult, so we should expect some schools not to be able to do this. It's an ongoing problem. We should keep struggling with it. I would suggest that we have an education system which produces poor management, that depends upon a degree of poor management. If you have created a neoliberal marketplace in which schools operate, then some must fail. In such a marketplace, poor schools are inevitable, and failure is wired into the system. Failure for a proportion of students, maybe 30, 40%, will leave school having failed in some way. They'll perceive themselves as failures, and schools must fail in order that others should succeed. That's the logic of the marketplace. And the managers of those schools and the people in those schools and the teachers in those schools will be convinced that somehow if they could do it better, if only they could embrace the culture better, it might work for them. And for some, of course, it will, because there are winners, just as there's going to be losers inevitably. And in many ways, I feel deeply sorry for teachers listening to this, because they might well think that it's a very esoteric sort of conversation. I don't know how many times I've heard good teachers I know are hardworking with their heart in the right place, say things like, students don't show respect these days, parents don't support the school these days. Is it too much to ask that students should sit and listen and obey the rules and come prepared with a pen and so forth to school? But then, of course, they're like the poor old caged animals in the zoo. They're pacing up and down and pulling their hair out because they've been driven half mad by a system that will be tormentingly impossible for them to succeed in. The students will behave badly because it's a poisonous system.
I don't think, John, this is an education problem. I think this is across like the entire, not just the entire country, the entire world, right? I mean, any industry anywhere would say, if you went to their kind of industry conference and you talked to them about the quality of management, people would be saying, oh, it's a challenge, we've not cracked this, it's not how we want it to be. People would say that anywhere. And again, there is a big difference between knowing what people need to be able to do and them doing it. Just ask any teacher, right? You know what you want your kids to be able to do. The kids often know what they need to do, but doing to do it is hard. Right? Like, it takes a bunch of practice. It takes the right conditions. It takes the right motivation. Yeah. It is difficult. I don't think that means we should give up on the endeavor or that it's not the right thing to do. It's just, we've got to keep plodding along with human progress and try and get better at it.
But in the plodding along, there'll be someone somewhere saying, well, there are things that are stopping us doing the things we know we should do that I think are wrong. And in doing that, they're asking what schools are for. So I'll move away from managerial now, and I'll end, because we're running out of time. I'll end on this. Our last thought is that one of my jobs, so I was the head of year 13 for a number of years, and one of my jobs was to prepare students to go to university. And we would run these special courses for them so they could apply to places like Oxford and Cambridge and so on, and be successful getting there. And all the time I would, knowing that I was trying to get students to be successful because it would dramatically transform their lives if they were. The getting into this university would make a big difference to getting into that university, getting these GCSE results. And earlier in our conversation, you said that you shouldn't stand in front of students and say, it's the end of the world if you fail your exams. And it isn't the end of the world, but it is bigger than just quite helpful if you have good exams. There'll be lots of people, millions of people out there in our society who have left school with a sense of their own personal failure. That school somehow convinced them it was them. That they have not measured up. They were measured and they were found wanting. And I think that examination system emphasizes so much of a difference between getting a grade in mathematics and not getting that grade. One number can make a big difference to your life. You can't become a nurse without this grade. You can become a nurse with one grade better, and so on. So I think if I could say what schools are for, well, they are not for that. And I would have significantly reduced the amount of examination and the high stakes exams, because for all of our wanting to build a caring and sharing culture, in the end, we're going to engineer students' failure and disappointment in a very large number of cases.
Look, I've got a view on what schools are for. I'd love to have a couple of minutes to be able to talk a bit about it. But again, in the theme of me politely disagreeing with you,
Yeah.
I've got to come back on that one because, look, I'm a mathematician. I don't like thresholds. I would much rather, for example, on your sort of one grade difference makes a big difference. I would much rather that instead of grades, we gave everyone their score and the confidence interval around it, because that is statistically more meaningful. I would much rather do, exams are a measure of what people can do. And at some point, if you can't do the maths and you don't know the maths to be a nurse, like, you shouldn't be a nurse, right? And that's not a thing about your worth. That's not a statement about your potential. It's not a statement about what you could achieve. And it's not a statement about who you are as a person, but there's a factual statement about whether or not you know the maths that is required for a particular job. And we do need to know before we let someone be a nurse, whether they know the required maths to be a nurse.
Do our schools test whether you have the required maths? There's a difference between a level 4 GCSE or a level 5, distinguished being not knowing the maths you need to be a nurse and knowing the maths you need to be a nurse. That would be an arbitrary judgment. So some external person will say to you, you don't have the maths necessary to be a nurse. Well, I could never get the hang of quadratic equations. Well, are they going to come up much at being a nurse?
You can get a grade 4 or 5 GCSE without being able to do quadratic equations.
There'll be some element of, I would guess that all the maths I've required as a teacher of history, politics, and things of that kind in my career, I'd learned pretty much before I'd left by the time I'd left primary school. But I couldn't have become a teacher without having my O level in maths. And yet the O level will be stuffed with all sorts of things I haven't used since I left school. Not a decision based on the maths you need to be a teacher, the maths you need to be a nurse, the maths you need to be a doctor. They'll have drawn a decision, a line, and with all lines, it'll be arbitrary and it'll have serious life consequences for people if they fall the wrong side.
Yeah,
and it won't be tested in a way that's particularly
that's a feature of how people are choosing to use it, right? And employers have made a decision. In this case, the employer of teachers is it's not the government, but indirectly in a sense it's the government. And they've made a decision that achieving a certain level of mathematics, like achieving a grade 4 in mathematics at GCSE or a C at O level, that's the employer's decision. That's not a feature of the exam system. It shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's not important, because when have I ever used that bit of historical knowledge? Because that is, and now, sorry, I'm going to come on to the purpose of education and like what schools are for. Because for me, a really important thing schools are for is to teach you some stuff that you're going to use. But it's a purpose. It's just one purpose. And it gets over, people assume that some, STEM subjects in particular, that their only value is a utilitarian value. And we don't apply that to other subjects, and we shouldn't. I mean, my sense, what schools are for, right? Well, what schools are for? The schools are for lots of things. Let's narrow it down a bit and think about kind of curriculum. Like, what should we teach? How should we choose what we teach? Right? I think there's sort of 3 things. The stuff that we teach because It's what makes us human, right? Humans want to understand their world. They want to know how it works. They want to understand the stories that led to it. They want to be able to create, to be able to make music and art and dance. And they want to know what happened 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago and where the universe came from and what's going to happen tomorrow and why. These are all things that I see in my 2-year-old.
Yeah.
You see from the earliest days, right? And they are valuable whether or not you are going to use them in any kind of productive way. I had an amazing experience where I was privileged enough to sit in on a round table about special needs education. And I sat in on it with a wonderful man who had been to a specials as a child. I was sat at my desk and I almost cried my way through this round table because he described how, because he was at a special school, he never got taught science. Someone decided that he wasn't allowed to know how plants grow because he'd never use it. We never got taught history. Someone decided that because he'd never use it, because he had a cognitive impairment, just wasn't allowed to know the stories of our past. And that took away his right as a human. I think part of what makes us human is that. And I think that then that is important. There is stuff that is useful, that gives us an ability to use in the world, that gives us an intuition about how the world around us works. And there's lots of examples of that. And there is stuff that is going to allow us to improve the world, to get to the next frontier of our chosen disciplines, to get to the next frontier of maths, of science, of history, of art. So I think we care about all of those things. And to me, particularly STEM subjects get lumped just in that kind of second and third bucket of what you need to understand the world as it is, or maybe to push the next frontier for a kind of few lone geniuses.
Yeah, no, I agree with you about STEM. I think that it's often justified purely on sort of utilitarian terms. These are the subjects that will get you a good job. These are the subjects that our economy needs. This is what Britain lacks, etc., etc. As opposed to some sort of, well, I'll accept that definition, that schools are for helping us be human. It's a very good purpose. And I think we both absolutely agree on that. We might disagree about how you go about that. So then we'd end up saying, well, that's where we started, John, because we said we're all going to disagree about what kind of schools there are. In having the conversation where we've arrived at, I would say I could easily look at history just as critically as I looked at maths and say, what sort of history should you learn and where, and all sorts of political decisions about British history being more important for people in Britain and certain types of British history.
Yeah, you're never going to get a real history teacher.
And so on. There are huge subjects there, So what is contained in those subjects and why we teach them? Underlyingly, we're all trying to enable us to live flourishing lives, which goes as far back as Aristotle. That's pretty much what he said. Aristotle's idea of what education was for was to flourish. We would then, me and you, I guess, disagree about the purpose and success of managers. We would disagree about exams and to what extent we'd use them. And I think we would have a valuable discussion, no matter how far we pursued it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for giving me this time. And I hope that anyone listening to this will think, well, there's all sorts of things that I disagree with what John said there or what David said, or they will agree and will understand that whether broadly or more narrowly, that the question of what schools are for is useful, I would say.
And I think what's interesting, right, is there are some areas in this that we agree. There are a bunch where we disagree. Yeah. I still think you run a great sixth form, right? And I'd still be happy if my kid went to your sixth form. Because as long as it's not, maybe there are some mad purposes that people could think of what schools are for. Although I don't really think that actually is the case. So good people wanting to run stuff well with the best interest of the kids at heart tend to run it well.
Yes. Although in history and in the world we live in today, we could go to plenty of countries where schools are being run for quite mad purposes and quite unpleasant purposes as well. Because school is the first place you go when you want to change human beings to be the way you want them to be. And when you observe that can be a problem, well, let's at least know we're doing it. You're doing it. Even in our lovely, caring democracy, we will tend to want to change students to be the way we want them to be. And we have to be careful. So being careful, at least. is good.
Right.
So, David, thank you. I know that you've given me more than an hour. That's wonderful.
Got 90
Thank you once again. And once again, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Good to chat.
And that brings to an end this episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. I hope you enjoyed my discussion with David Thomas, OBE, and founder of Oak National Academy, former head teacher, and current CEO of Axiom Maths. With special thanks for the music to Dr. Richard Miller. If you wish to listen to this discussion again, you can find it on Spotify and many other platforms, including the Teachers Talk Radio site. Thank you for listening. Join me again in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.